Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm here with Matt from Foundation Father. Matt, thanks for joining me today.
No, thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So I've been really inspired by a lot of things that Matt posts on Twitter, and it really has got me thinking. And there's sometimes where he'll mention something that I feel is really on the edge of my thinking. And so this is kind of what this podcast is all about, is to kind of sharpen each other and talk about topics that are hitting kind of right where just beginning to try to understand something that's growing. So I want to read something that Matt posted and then just kind of talk with him about a little bit. So there's a little kind of a quick thread that he posted a few days ago. And any internet atheist, if plopped down in a pre-Christian pagan culture, would be begging for some form of Christendom within 5 minutes. And then he says, best case scenario, they find a household to enslave themselves to with a master that wouldn't treat them too harshly. But that's a slim chance they'd probably be raped at some point. Have you ever read the first 5 books of the Bible and thought, why in the world did they need a law against that? You don't have to think hard to come up with these answers and realize you'd rather live under that harsh Jewish law than any other nation. Nearly every virtue that you take for granted today would be completely foreign to the ancient pagan world. Care for the poor? Not really. Equality of women? Don't make me laugh. Bodily autonomy for rich men? Sure. Freedom? LOL. So basically, internet atheists are like fish complaining about the water they're swimming in. They should have some gratitude, because if things keep going like they are, we're headed for a pagan society once more. And internet atheists will get what they wish for, good and hard. So, this is something I've been really wrestling with, and that is this. And you're teasing it out in this in these tweets. There is a sort of a baseline like misunderstanding when people particularly read the Bible about the kind of culture that people lived in back then, and they're swimming in waters, they're taking in all of the all the good things from Christendom, and they're not really even acknowledging that. So I'd love to kind of go one layer deeper. How do you think about that? Like when you hear somebody complaining like this, like an internet atheist about the world, what is that triggering for you in terms of how you view the world, your worldview?
Yeah, what's hard to not think about, oh, well, thank God I'm not like this atheist over here who's ignorant and has no idea what he's talking about type of thing. So that's the first thing to check to make sure you don't have that attitude. But on Twitter and social media, the whole point is quick, pithy statements. So
yeah,
I think one thing is that we've done such a terrible job of actually educating people of how the world really was and is, and we have this romanticized view of the ancient world. Where there's some good things too. I love the ancient books as much as anyone, but it doesn't take too long to be saturated in them to realize something is vastly different values than we have here right now. And even you would call us post-Christendom, post-Enlightenment. We still take so much for granted. We're still sort of chugging along on the momentum of Christendom. The dregs, so to speak, the fumes,
yes,
are still in the engine.
Yes.
But people don't realize that. They think this civilization was just plopped down out of nowhere, out of thin air. And so things just don't happen by accident. And so that's sort of what I'm thinking. And there's ideas have consequences. Every action has consequences. All these things work to form a culture. Yeah. And so, that's sort of where I'm thinking, where I go.
Yeah. And I think that is a real challenge for the way that people today are, that experience of all of the benefits of Christian civilization without any realization that those things are based on ideas. And those ideas once you purge society of them, you revert back to the way life was. And so this is where you have to be really careful what you're wishing for. I think in particular, like your second statement, which is definitely one of the places my brain goes to when I think about pre-Christian civilizations. Best case scenario, you find yourself enslaved um, in a different household. I'd love to maybe even talk about that a little bit more, like in detail, like how when people were really struggling, like how do you see the safety net that existed in that pre-Christian pagan culture?
Yeah, so there really wasn't a safety net. There really was no general view of human dignity for everyone. The Greeks regarded barbarians as lesser creatures, for example. There wasn't really that much pity for the poor. Um, so the only safety net was basically slavery. and
Yes.
and so and that's one reason why the Jewish law still had slavery. That now it outlawed man stealing,
Yeah.
which was absolutely forbidden, and selling people into slavery like that. But it allowed people to voluntarily put themselves into slavery or some form of indentured servitude.
Yes.
And so when people complain and look down on their ivory throne from modern day in ease and their air conditioning units and all this other stuff, and they criticize slavery as an institution,
Yeah.
what they don't realize is the actual use. Why did this institution actually grow up and form?
Yeah.
Why was it there? And it's because it was better to be a slave than starve to death on the side of the street. That now, depending on where you were, maybe that wasn't the case, but it actually grew up in that for a reason. There was an actual reason for it.
Right.
And so in the context of households, a household might enslave distant relatives. If you fell on hard times, you could go and enslave yourself to a distant relative, or they would collect vagrants
Mhm.
um, and take care of them. For of course they would become slaves, but they would be responsible for them after that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and of course there are abuses. There's abuses in everything.
Right.
And I'm not here to be an evangelist for slavery, but we have to look at clear eyes and look at it in sense of reality and how things actually were, and not assume a magic wand
Right.
was waved over our civilization and things just plopped down out of nowhere. So
Yeah. Yeah. There's sort of like two topics I think when I try to dive into this that I think are really important for people to understand. One is the whole safety net, kind of the reality that people, when they're drowning, just like if someone were drowning, what they're willing to do in order to get out of a survival situation is very different. And so a lot of our intuitions are formed out of the assumption that we're wealthy and stable and no one's going to starve. And you
Mhm.
have the privilege from that perspective to have certain ideas. And so that's, if you're in a civilization where your family's starving, if you, there's no like wealthy state that can sort of take on the burden of that situation. And so the only way, and you're going, if you grab onto another family, you're likely going to pull them under. And so the idea is, okay, if you're going to do that, there's got to be a strong family, and they have to exact from you the value in order to ensure that you're not going to destroy their family while they try to help you or feed you. And so that's the way oftentimes these kinds of, especially in the Old Testament, the first 5 books in the Torah, that's kind of what's being described, it seems, is families that are making
Mhm.
a choice of horrible situations. This was the less horrible option. Then there's the
Yeah.
other point you're making about kind of the dignity, and that is like, if you have a situation in which this, of all the bad options, this is one of the better of the bad options, then you want to have laws that actually protect the people who are in this situation, and that's why you have these laws. I think
Mhm.
that so often, this is like a kind of a hide the ball situation with a lot of people, where they are assuming all of the values of Christianity, and they're assuming all the wealth of the West, and then they look at an institution like slavery in ancient times, and they feel morally superior. And it's really
Mhm.
you can't do both. Like, you have to either enter into the conditions of that world and judge it properly from that vantage point, or you have to keep your perspective from the current vantage point and have gratitude for what's created the situation that you're in. But it's really the two moves that kind of seems just radically unfair and just not helpful.
Yeah. It's people don't understand that slavery is the default state of humanity for most of human history.
Yeah.
Like that, if you were born at any other time, you probably would have been a slave.
Yeah.
At some point. And so, we can deal with that reality, or we can just ignore it and judge it with some chronological snobbery. But
Yeah.
that is the way it was.
Yes. Yes.
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
And then this last thing that you kind of describe, like these values of care for the poor, equality of women, bodily autonomy, and freedom, these things that people take for granted today, that didn't exist in the pagan world at all. So when we're talking about maybe slavery aside, we're just talking about these values that people then assume kind of exist. And I think the way that I hear most people making this argument is that these are Enlightenment values. Basically, there was a time where people, 200-300 years ago, got really interested in reason, and they reasoned themselves to these values. How do you think about that claim?
I think about that never would have happened without the soil of Christendom in the first place. So there's a great book called The Victory of Reason by Rodney Stark. And he has other books about this, like how monotheism shapes a culture, and lots of other books that sort of dance around the same topic. But The Victory of Reason gets to the heart of it. And one of the questions at the end is, why didn't China have a scientific revolution? Even though they definitely had the ability, they had some of the wealth, they had all these other conditions. It's like, well, they might have had the ability. Did they have the desire to? Did they have this culture that actually pushed them toward that direction? And so everything you look at in the West, in particular, all the first scientists were also theologians of some sort, at least all the popular ones. And so none of this would have happened. The whole thing, all empiricism grew out of the idea of we can understand this world because it was created, and all these assumptions that were built in. So even then, they're swimming in these same assumptions. The Enlightenment tried to divorce reason from these assumptions and try to create these two different worlds. There's an internal life of faith, and there's an external world of reason and objectivity, but that's not really true.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of like leap that I feel like so many people don't seem to understand they're making. That is, you can start from Enlightenment rationalism and end up almost any ethical sort of situation. The fact that you end up in a very, what sounds like a very Christian set of ethics isn't because those are generally rational. It's because you started from that position. And this is, I think the person who noticed this the most profoundly was Nietzsche. He was like, oh, we can free ourselves from this whole moral system. And he was one of the most brilliant, rational people that we've seen in the West. And he could separate the two. But it seems, and this is what confuses me today, it doesn't seem like today's atheists are able to do that. I don't know why. I don't know why they're not experimenting with radical new forms of ethics, and why they're assuming that all the Christian presuppositions are somehow sacred and are perfectly rational. I don't know what your thoughts are, but because that really confuses me.
The Family Plan Calendar is the new way to keep your family team organized. Plan your rhythms, menu, household chores, and notes for the family all in one place. Visit familyteams.com to purchase.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't have any of the intellectual atheists anymore, even the fun ones like Christopher Hitchens. Just good polemics that could actually write and be entertaining. which is at least something.
Yeah.
um, but I don't know. I think it's sort of late stage atheism where the rot, the consequences of everything has just started to seep in. And so you see most of them are just going along with whatever the current regime thinks and wants to dictate as moral is also the moral thing. So it's just another will to power. They really believe in a will to power, even though they don't really use those words.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche's great because he's actually understandable, and he says what he means clearly. And even if you think his ideas are terrible, you can at least understand what he's talking about.
Right.
And he doesn't try to hide it behind
Yeah.
Fancy words and all this other stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, he seems to be reasoning from first principles. And I think that
Mhm.
what I think you're critiquing is that oftentimes atheists are not doing that, and they're not acknowledging the axioms that they're building their ethics and their assumptions from. And it's that move that I think is really, we have to do something with that move. It's just it's clearly going to lead people to wrong conclusions. And it's so ironic that you would judge Christianity from while standing on Christian presuppositions and not recognize that you're doing that.
Mhm.
It's perfectly fine to do that as long as you acknowledge that that's what you're doing. Now we can look at those presuppositions, and even like I don't know if this is part of where the inspiration for the name Foundation Father came from, but it seems like this is a pattern of thinking that that you're working from. Like, let's get back to first principles, and then let's begin to start to think about what the implications of this are, even because that tends to be where you get some of the most surprising and most helpful insights.
Yeah, going back to older ideas, which I forgot who said it, but if you want new ideas, read old books, right? So and go back to the original thinkers,
Yeah.
and like first principles, because they're dealing more with first principles, and you can start reasoning again from that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think also it's just that, and I called out internet atheists particular because it's so much posturing, and it seems they've taken meme culture, and while memes can be a great rhetorical device, it's like they've completely inverted it and turned them into the conversation.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
uh,
Yes. Well, maybe taking this full circle, as we've kind of like started with, okay, there's a reality with kind of base survival that we've surpassed, and the household has changed because of that, and now we have a very different setup, and there's all these assumptions being made about ethics. Yeah, how would you how have you thought about how you would think about a safety net in the modern world? If we were to start from first principles and try to think about how to provide ethically for people, is there is there any like right now it just seems like we keep talking about universal basic income, or like that we've got to have more and more entitlements, and how do you see that sort of that tension that exists between those who want to help people that are struggling, and what is just and fair, and what's actually gonna help people in the long run?
yeah, that's a tough question. So we have the curse of these Christian sensibilities and values while also gutting all the institutions and their power that had done so much work in upholding them. And so um, the church a lot of times abdicated its responsibilities in many ways. And so that was taken up by the state. And I don't know. There's a interesting book called Man and Woman in Christ, and he's talking about mainly the differences in roles between men and women. But he also deals a lot with the differences between a technological society, which is what we are now, where all of our relationships seem to be based on functional roles as opposed to relational groupings. And how drastic a change that is. It really is a new thing in human history. So instead of like
Mm.
a father might just give a business to a son because it's a son, his son might not be the best person for that job, but because it's his son, he's going to inherit the business, right? That's how the world used to work. But now we have these functional relationships, purely functional, like job descriptions and
Yeah.
functional institutions. And you can't, and everything is separated. So you
Right.
have functional and then you have emotional needs, and those are completely separated. And we've seen
Mm.
one of I'll criticize like diversity, equity, inclusion stuff a lot because its origins are terrible, but they are trying to answer a real problem because we have completely destroyed some of the emotional needs of, or how these relationships fulfilled also emotional needs, these strong relationships. And so I don't know. It's not an easy problem to
Yeah.
solve
Yeah.
for.
So, yeah, part of what you're describing is in a world where we could assume that like some of these problems need to be solved by institutions that actually have a sort of foundational beliefs, because then you could see which foundational beliefs actually cause long-term flourishing. But when you basically create institutions without foundational beliefs and then give them the mandate to help people that are less fortunate, then it's very difficult for them to make hard decisions. And so like one example you're pointing out is if the church has deep foundational beliefs about the role of men and women, and that they're becoming fathers and mothers, then you could make a lot of different kinds of assumptions about how to help, let's say like a 25-year-old man or a 34-year-old woman who's a single mother. You could there's ways in which you would help them to get them closer to the ideal, because you're operating from a set of foundational principles where you have an ideal and you kind of know where you're trying to lead them. But in the government doesn't have an ideal. It just is like, let's not starve, let's not, and then it says, well, let's make everybody equal, even though we don't know, like that then becomes the default ideal, which is sort of a disaster if the ideal should be, let's say, a flourishing family. And so then you're basically funding the creation of individuals who are trying to further society, raise children, express their gender in ways that are hyper individualized. And so those are mutually exclusive ideas, but one becomes the default of a social safety net that is being enacted by a completely neutral, supposedly neutral party that can't think about anything from a first principles. It's just everything seems like up for grabs for that will to power you described earlier.
Mhm. Yeah, and I've talked to someone who is pretty high up in this Christian consultancy agency, very close with the owner, and just to give an idea of how something might work that's more relational and less functional, this owner has hired people who, in a lot of cases, just aren't good at their jobs, but he's hired them because they're part of his religious community, as part of his church, and they need help supporting their families. And even though, at most they might be average for the position, and he's had business consultants come in, and the guy gives studies them and then gives this full report about, well, I've I've done all these things. I've located all these areas where you could improve to make more money. And the owner just looked at him and said, "Well, what makes you think I want to make more money and make this business more profitable?" That's not, like, to him. That's not his mission for the business,
Oh,
which is interesting. And there's a lot of arguments you can go for that because, well, if you have a business, well, of course you want it to be profitable because that's actually what makes possibilities, and that's what allows you to do all these other things. But how much is enough,
mm, yeah,
type of thing? And what are those profits for? It's just interesting how some people they want to get back to that more relational aspect of life with more stable relationships as opposed to just purely um, functional units,
yes,
cogs in the machine, because
yeah,
it is less stable, and it does bring into question like what we're seeing in our culture. Like, what do you do with older people who aren't functional anymore? What do you do with babies who aren't functional?
right,
Right? And and our culture, in a lot of ways, treats these two extremes in terrible ways.
right.
And that's a consequence of the same thing, I think. So yeah, it's an interesting problem space to think about.
Yes. But that's a helpful framework, that there's a relational versus a transactional way of thinking about these
Yes.
problems. And so it seems like the government's forced to think about it transactionally. But what if the only real healthy way to handle this is relationally, at that kind of more local level where people know each other and where there is an ethical framework that is being enacted alongside of the physical? And so these things are deeply intertwined. And so to think that you can separate these two ideas and say, we're just going to deal with the physical needs on some massive federal program, and to think that you're not going to somehow incite a completely different spiritual reality, because these things are totally intertwined, you can't do that. The only way you can address both is at that local relational level, from the standpoint of your core beliefs, like this guy you're describing, who is, his core beliefs are like, it's profit's not the most important thing. At this point, I feel great about the amount of money I'm making. Now it's much more about serving my community. But I want to just thank you for having this conversation with me today. On those of you guys who are listening, please take a look at Foundation Father on Twitter. It's at Foundation Dads. Anywhere else, Matt, that we could point people that would be helpful?
Yeah. So mafranklin.com is what I write under as well, for more general topics. But if you want to dig a little deeper, you could look at, there's a video of Tom Holland talking to N.T. Wright about this very thing, where he thought he was culturally pagan. He thought he was had more in common with the pagan world, and then he realized after more study that, well, no, actually, I have more in common with Christians, even though he's not a Christian, right?
Yes.
And so he has this whole conversation, and the depth charge that the letter to Philemon was to Western civilization in general. So that, and he did that as part of promotion for his book Dominion, which is about this topic, which I haven't read, but I've heard it's good.
Yeah, definitely check out that. Tom Holland, the Oxford historian, not the actor, who's
Right.
talking to
Yes.
NC Wright. Yeah.
An important distinction.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think that would probably be the smoothest pill to swallow when it comes to this topic.
That's interesting about Philemon. Yeah, I'd love to see that. I don't know if I've seen that conversation, but I'd love to look at that. Well, Matt, thanks so much for joining me today. Appreciate it. Thoughts.
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.